Okay, well, 2 minutes past 5, we'll make a start. So welcome everyone. My name's Sarah Gibbon. I'm a member of the Embodied Inequalities of the Anthropocene Project, a collaboration between UCL, CSIS in Mexico and the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, who together with UCL's Health Mind Society Network are hosting tonight's seminar. So before handing over to Rebecca Irons, who's the organizer of the Blue Anthropocene Seminar Series and chairing tonight's talk, I just wanted to alert you to the 2 other seminars we've already had in this series that are available to view on our pages on the UCL Anthropocene website, and also will be added ultimately to our Embodied Inequalities of the Anthropocene Teach Tool. So we'll put both of those links in the chat for everyone in a moment. So it's been a really fascinating set of talks so far and hugely stimulating. I think we're critically reflecting on the situated issues of climate change and health, as this concerns issues of water, food, and various other issues in diverse global contexts. I'm really sure that tonight's talk will be equally as informative and interesting. So I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Sarah. So welcome everybody to the final seminar for the Blue Anthropocene in Latin America seminar series. So this evening we're joined by Sofía Rivera. She's assistant professor in anthropology at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogotá, Colombia. Her research interests intersect critical development studies, climate change, marine biodiversity loss, and energy transition in the Caribbean of Colombia. And tonight she'll be speaking to us about elusive coral and fish, reconsidering the shore-offshore separation in Caribbean archipelagos. So I'll hand over to you now, Sofía, if you'd like to share your PowerPoint. Now, please remind everybody to stay muted. We'll have time for questions at the end, or any questions that you have as they arise, you can put those in the chat and we'll come around to them also at the end of the seminar. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and I thank you in advance for all your questions, comments, ideas of collaboration. I'm very much looking forward to learn about your work and your research and your interests too. Rebecca gave you an article that was published in the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Today, I think I will do something slightly different. Like I will talk about that paper, but I will also situate the paper so you have a broader context of the questions that I present there. So I organized the presentation in 4 parts. The first one will be a brief introduction to my PhD research. That was the basis for the text that you read. Then I will introduce some questions surrounding marine planning and geographical delimitations. Third, I will talk about how coral or the questions about marine biodiversity loss meet just energy transitions in Colombia, in particular in the Caribbean. And then fourth, we'll have some time for conversation and comments and questions. I will keep track of the time. But yeah, like I hope that we have lots of time for conversations. So first, my PhD research, I did my PhD in anthropology with designated emphasis in science and technology studies at the University of California, Davis, in the US from 2014 to 2021. And it was an ethnography on the loss of marine biodiversity near the shore, mainly in the Rosario archipelago, that it's part of the jurisdiction of Cartagena in Colombia. And this research was at first inspired by these various people and more, and also at the time that I was thinking of what to do for my PhD, I was also facing lots of news about a massive and prolonged bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef between 2014 to 2016, and many discussions surrounding the extinction of coral. And then we have these different people, Donna Haraway, talking of symbiosis and how this figure of symbiosis also provoked other thoughts of politics and how to think of the Anthropocene. She proposes another concept different from Anthropocene, that it's the Tulucene. Stefan Henrik also traces how coral emerges in the 1990s as an index of global warming in the UN international conferences. And then we have people like Amelia Moore that also present a critical stand towards the funding of corporate responsibility, that it's funding coral restoration programs in the Caribbean, especially in the Bahamas. And Iris Braverman that has this wonderful book that it's called Coral Whispers, and that inquires about how the coral scientific communities feel and understand and have different stances towards the possibilities of coral restoration. And then we have a group of people here. I have Tom Van Doyen, but there is a larger group of people, including Deborah Bird Rose, Michelle Bastian, and others that are under this umbrella of the social studies of extinction, and that interrogate extinction as the individual deaths of individuals, and also as a slow and accumulative process of the death of long lineages. And they also think of this death as the death of worlds, of entire worlds and relations that disappear with these species. And then we have Alexis Worms, that you might also have read, this book of Black feminist lessons from marine mammals. And then we also have Anna Apple, and she has all these inquiries surrounding these infrastructures, including juridical infrastructures, and in particular the concept of offshore and how it enables certain exploration and exploitations of oil and gas as if they were nowhere. So here I have a map to situate for you Cartagena in the big Caribbean. So here you have Colombia. I hope that you see the arrow. Cartagena is part of the continental Caribbean. These are other places where there are various coral restoration programs: Isla Fuerte, Santa Marta, San Andrés, Santa Catalina, and Providencia. And then Cartagena was one of the three main ports during the Spanish trade of people forced into slavery between the 1500s and 1800s. It's also the main tourist destination in Colombia. It also hosts one of the main port systems in the Caribbean, and it also has a large petrochemical center. So all of these things come together in Cartagena. Cartagena is also an archipelago. Here I will show you in another map. So Cartagena itself, different neighbors, are part of a system of various islands. And here we have Tierra Bomba. We also have the island of Barú and the Corales del Rosario archipelago, that it was a place where I worked. So as I told you before, I was inspired by the work of different people thinking of coral during the massive and prolonged bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. But then as I thought, I started to ask questions about corals in the Caribbean of Colombia, that it's a place also familiar to me. My mother side of my family is from Cartagena, so it's a familiar place. Then I found that corals were also bleaching in the Caribbean since the 1980s. So here I brought a picture of Elvira Alvarado, that it's one of the main coral scientists in Colombia, and this is part of her archive. One of the dominant species of coral in the 1980s in these reefs was Acropora palmata, and then she's documented how since the 1980s, the populations of acroporas register mortalities that reach 90%. And then I don't know how familiar you all are with coral, but these scientists think of coral as an animal that has tentacles, so it can feed by chasing phytoplankton and zooplankton, like these little things that move with the currents. And they can live in shallow waters, and they can also live in deep waters where the sunlight doesn't penetrate, so below 200 meters under the sea level. But those corals that live in places where there is some penetration of sunlight establish a symbiotic relation with a microalgae that lives in its tissues and that gives the colorful colors of coral. So bleaching, when we talk of bleaching, we talk of a condition in which the coral or this symbiotic relation responds to subtle changes of temperature in the medium. And then this relation breaks and coral loses its color and turns white. That's the reason of the name of bleaching. It doesn't necessarily mean that the coral is dead, but these coral scientists think that the coral becomes more vulnerable to various diseases that are also spreading since the 1980s throughout the Caribbean that might cause the death of these coral. So another thing that it's simultaneously happening to these coral reefs in the Caribbean, beside these effects of changing temperatures, has to be with acidification of the ocean. So some of the coral secrete calcium carbonate, and they create these tri-dimensional structures, solid, that are refugee for many species in the oceans. These coral are considered to be the builders of the reefs. And then with the acidification of the ocean, what happens is that these skeletons dissolve into the sand. So all of this is very preoccupying, but also coral scientists in the Caribbean of Colombia, and in particular in Cartagena, are worried not only about climate change and acidification, but they are also concerned about the bombazos del río, the bombs of the Magdalena River. So the Magdalena River is one of the largest rivers in Colombia that crosses the Andes and then pours the water into the Caribbean in Barranquilla, and there is an engineered branch of this river that comes into the Cartagena Bay. And as I told you before, Cartagena is also a petrochemical center. So what has happened since the 1990s is that the curves of the river have been strengthened to allow for the navigation of larger ships from the bay and into the bay to this petrochemical center. And what it does is that when there is time of the winds that come from the south, all of these fresh water from the river with all the sediments and all the pollutants come into the ocean like as strongly as a bomb into these corals. And coral, for these scientists, they think that they are very vulnerable beings. They need very stable conditions, not only in terms of temperature, of the pH of the water, of the medium, but they also need relative stability in the salinity of the water and the sunlight penetration. And then there is this idea also that the sediments can precipitate and can suffocate coral. So all of these comes into this coral in Cartagena. And then I want to show you here another map that presents Cartagena in a different light through the various conservation areas. So here we have the Corales del Rosario and San Bernardo Natural Park. And then in this red one is the marine protected area. So the restrictions here are higher than in this area, but this is also a protected area. And this square is a deep coral natural national park. And it was created in 2013. It was asked from different it was created to protect these coral, deep coral, that are deeper than 200 meters under the sea level from oil and gas exploration and exploitation. So here we have all of these protection areas, and just beside we have a ultra deep gas exploration area. And then so we have the parks, we have these oil and gas exploration areas, and another figure that maybe will be useful to understand this place will be the community councils of Black peoples in Colombia. So in Colombia we have constitution that it's from 1991. This constitution acknowledges that Colombia is a multicultural country, but the underlying assumption of this multicultural discourse that it's part of our constitution is that most of the people are mestizo white. And then I will show you other authors that talk of how this idea of mestizaje in Latin America, it's being whitening discourse that has been served the minorization of various peoples. So in Colombia, the constitution speaks of ethnic minorities, and those are indigenous peoples, but there are also Black, Raizal, Afrodescendant, Palenqueros in rural areas, and Gypsy or Rom communities. So this Law 70 of 1983 recognizes similar rights to those that the Constitution recognizes for indigenous peoples to communities that identify as Black, and they are organized around community councils of Black peoples. And some of those rights are collective titles to land and also the rights to prior consultation. So in Colombia, this law was also suppressed by the mobilization of different processes in the Pacific of Colombia. But to bring this to the Caribbean has been challenging because some of those processes in the Pacific were more around rivers. And now one of the challenges in the Caribbean has been to achieve the recognition of the state under two sea territories. So one of the claims of these community councils in the Caribbean is that the territories doesn't end onshore, but they also go to offshore or to beside the shore. And they are also part of the important ways how these groups understand their life and a life worth living, and their own plans of life. And here I want to point this, that it's the mar nullis, that it's a juridical rationale that considers the sea socially empty and denies communities' rights beyond the shore. This is a parallel concept to that of terra nullis, but terra nullis has been widely contested in the continent, while mar nullis is still very strong and it's hard to contest. So even for progressive governments as the one that we have right now of Gustavo Petro, like this idea of the sea as being socially empty is an idea that remains. And before I introduce you to different authors that inspire my initial thoughts about coral, but here I wanted to bring other authors who are Colombians and who also study dynamics around history and coloniality and the sea, but they also bring different questions. So, and something that I find also interesting here is that many of these scholars and researchers are women. So we have Ana Isabel Márquez, Inge Valencia, Andrea Leiva, Lavinia Fiori, and some of these people, let me see, the kind of questions that they ask are more around the dispossession and the community rights to the sea, and they inscribe their research more around research action, participation. Wilder Guerra is a Guayú indigenous anthropologist, and he also brings questions of Guayú political ontology. And then authors such as Mara Viveros Vicoya, she is one of these anthropologists that has an historical account of coloniality, which is different from colonialism, because colonialism is considered to be an epoch and that may be thought as already past, while coloniality traces the legacies of colonialism today, in particular in relation to the nation state. And that relation with the nation state, also because of the various contestations of various groups of people, it's very prominent in the anthropology in Colombia. So what I did was I took coral as an entry point. I did field work in different moments in 2016, 2017 to 2018. That was the prolonged period in which I lived in the islands. In 2019, I worked alongside coral restorers, marine scientists working on the assisted reproduction of endangered fish species, such as the Pinephelus itahara, the giant grouper, and artisanal fishers. And this category of artisanal fishing here, I want to say that it's a political category in the sense that the national park, because the islands where I work were part of this national park, allows in certain areas for survival fishing. And so these artisanal fishers claim that what they do is not just for surviving, but they also have commercial purposes. So they differentiate artisanal fishing from survival fishing, that it's the one that the coral or that the biology conservation allows, but also from industrial fishing. And I also worked as a volunteer in a center for research, education, and recreation, where these scientists do coral restoration and the reproduction of the grouper. I worked with the permission of the Community Council of Islands and the Corales del Rosario and San Bernardo National Park. And I also participated in various international scientific conferences on coral and coral restoration and other restoration programs in the Caribbean and in the prior consultation of the management plan of the Corales del Rosario and San Bernardo Marine Protected Area. So all of these brings me to these different points that concentrate on some of my questions. So I have a question of these marine biodiversity loss, especially in relation to a geography or to an specialization of that disappearance, opening the terms of that loss, not only in terms of death, but also in terms of migration. I'm interested also in these community rights to the sea under this prevalence of marnulis, even today. And more recently, I've been intrigued by how just energy transition projects also meet in the Caribbean. And all of these comes together under the umbrella of governmental, institutional, corporate responses to climate change. So you read this article, I guess, that it's in the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology, that is Elusive Coral and Fish, Reconsidering the Shore-offshore Separation in Caribbean Archipelagos. So to sum up the main argument or some of the main claims is through this work, I tried to add stories or to the stories of marine biodiversity death that are most of the stories in these conservation biology accounts or even policy accounts. I add other stories of connectivity and multi-species migration. And I'm doing this in a time where the previous government, that it was the one of Ivan Duque, was expanding protected areas near shore in Colombia to meet these international commitments of reaching 30% of the sea of each country protected by 2030. So he was expanding these protected areas, and he was also giving unprecedented funding for coral restoration. But at the same time, he was also expanding the energy offer under these ideas of energy transition, but energy transition not necessarily in terms of decarbonization, but in terms of diversifying the energy matrix. So that is also interesting for me, how it is possible under the same umbrella of responses to climate change to have simultaneously the expansion of these protected areas and the expansion of oil and gas exploration relatively nearby. But then the limitations give the idea or the impression of resolving something that it's not taking necessarily into account the deep connectivity and migrations of fish and coral, but also of the people who partially move with them too, that are some of the fishers, and I will talk more about that in a little bit. So, and I'm also talking of this relation as elusive, as hard to grasp or hard to elucidate, to the lens of extinction and also the same governmental protection efforts. I'm speaking of these vital spaces of transit that I'm also thinking with the scholars that think of migration. And I'm thinking of how this connectivity ties humans and non-humans, not only in relation to proximity, but in relation to these vital spaces of transit that some fishes do, but that enable the ways of life of many people in the islands and the continent. And I'm also talking about a geography of disappearance. So different from this idea of loss that necessarily indexes death, I'm saying maybe beside death, there are other processes that are also happening, and that some fishers are following by innovating with their fishing techniques and with their trips. They are taking more risks to try to follow some of the fishes that are commercial fishes, that are also endangered fishes, that artisanal fishers used to find near the islands 20 and 30 years ago. So here I am also doing 3 contributions to anthropological research and to social studies of extinction. What I was just saying, I'm introducing this idea of a geography of disappearance to the literature on Marnullis, that it's focused on rights and that it's human-centered. I'm also contributing at the conceptualization of these separations at the sea, not only between the mar and the land, or the terra, and I'm thinking of how these separations nowadays in the sea make possible something that seems to be paradoxical. It's like the simultaneous expansion of restoration and conservation, and also like the intensification of industrial developments offshore. And then this space that it's less studied by many social researchers at the intersection between multi-species ethnographies and science and technology studies. That what I especially carry from science and technology studies is this attention to practices and to questions that emerge as relevant within the different practices, the practices of coral restoration, the practices of the reproduction of fish, the practices of different techniques of artisanal fishing. So the article that you read had different sections. One of those was elusive corals and the limits of restoration experiments. So there are various people who have worked on coral restoration. Let's say that here something different, or maybe I don't know if it has been developed more recently, was to have as an entry point not the coral nurseries, but an event that happens once a year, that it's massive, that it's synchronic for the same species of fish, that it's the coral spawning, and that different or coral scientists think that coral reproduce in 2 ways. One is through asexual reproduction, so they facilitate the conditions for corals to grow in nurseries. But the idea is that in those nurseries, coral clone themselves. While in this annual event of coral spawning, there is also the mixing of genetic material. So if there is a hope for genetic diversity happens through these nights that these scientists can anticipate for, but they might not happen. And also they cannot control, and they cannot bring all to a lab, like an enclosed lab. So I'm thinking of these scientists as participants in an uncoordinated coordination event that exceeds their science and goes beyond these human temporalities and rhythms. And it's a very special night that the other islanders or people in the islands call as the nights where the sea gives birth, that happen also in synchronicity with other events, like for example, the hatching of turtle eggs. So, and even in these experiments, from what these scientists can collect and follow in their labs for a few weeks, the survival of the coral recruits is very little. And it happens in these labs that work under very precarious conditions, but it happens in more sophisticated labs in other places like Curacao. Like the rates of survival are similar to less than 5%. So I'm pointing to these scientists that are also like that they place their hopes in this event that they cannot control. So they are very humble kind of scientists at this time. But they are also relying on this event for the possibility of genetic diversity, that they think that it's very important because it will eventually make the reefs in the Caribbean less vulnerable to diseases. But that they also point to thinking of connectivity beyond the nurseries that seem to be enclosed and localized near the shore. And then we have this elusive fish, where what I trace here is fish through fishers and their fishing practices of some of the fishers who have motorboats and GPS and follow through the nights fishes in places that they call that the islands, and the lights disappear. So they are places where they put themselves under safety, under more risk. And then this idea that, according, for example, to conservation biology, there is this idea that fishing should disappear. But then these fishers consider fishing not to be going to disappear anytime soon, as it is a reliant practice and it takes out from much difficulty. So there are many people willing to take more risks. So something that it's possible by following simultaneously both these scientists and these fishers is to follow how these fishes might be or having greater strength than that attributed by human-centered vulnerability stories, and how these migrations of these fish are also partially shared by some of these fishers, that they also move with the fish. So some of the measures of these conservation areas is to delimitate areas where fishing is allowed, but these fishers won't not necessarily find fish always in those places, so they move with the fish. And fishing this time is also becoming every time more elusive to their practices too. And here there is another way to say how these fishes seem to be moving to places that are more remote, not only for scientists, not only for fishers, but that they are moving towards places that are facing more pressure, that they are considered offshore, and that they have all this pressure from different industrial developments under this idea of the blue economy, that it's a global environmental governance discourse that allows for the expansion of the extractive frontier to places with fewer known risks for humans and non-humans. In the case of oil and gas exploration and exploitation, there are risks associated with different stages of exploration and exploitation, and damages that are considered to be for perpetuity, although these projects, the life lifespan of these projects, or their productive lifespan might be only for 3 decades or so. And so, and this kind of exploration and exploitation, now it's 30% of worldwide oil and gas exploration and exploitation. So as you've been able to see, I'm very interested in these geographical delimitations and this idea of how they seem to be responding to something, and maybe pacify some people saying like, okay, we have more protection for coral and for fish, but simultaneously these different interventions in the ocean are also growing. And then this you didn't read, but I will tell you how all of this is getting together or meeting these discussions about energy transition in Colombia. So here I have talked about oil and gas exploration and exploitation. Gas is considered in Colombia and other places to be transition fossil fuel, so something that is controversially less contaminant or pollutant than other fossil fuels, and that it's also cheaper than other fossil fuels. So it's considered that to go or to pass through an energy matrix that is green, we might need the assistance of oil and of gas particular. But in Colombia, we also have this condition of very scarce proven reserves. So previous governments have experimented also with fracking. The current government has opposed fracking and has opposed the concession of new areas in the continent for oil and gas exploration and exploitation, but that doesn't touch the areas assigned in the ocean previously. So most of the efforts to find gas right now are on the sea. Colombia has exploited gas offshore, but near the shore in shallow water since the 1970s near La Guajira. But some of the explorations and explorations that it's the phase right now are in deep and ultra deep waters, like 864 meters under the sea level, 2,400 meters. And then there is this idea of how, so we have many of these assigned areas, I will show you a map later, are in the Caribbean. But we also have this idea that the green future will be a green hydrogen future. And green hydrogen requires large amounts of water in a region of Colombia where there is fresh water scarcity. So this water is thought to come from the ocean, and the residues of the process of desalinization to produce hydrogen will go back to the sea. And then hydrogen also needs large amounts of green energy. So those imply like large solar and wind farms. The Caribbean is considered to have, like from Cartagena up to La Guajira, some of the best winds worldwide. So there are all these various projects. Some of those in the continent are in indigenous territories and have been also very contested. So as they are contested in the continent, the sea appears as a more feasible alternative. So in the leather square, we have some images of how some of the windmills that are proposed for the continent are, and then in comparison to those proposed for offshore, so the ones for offshore are 3 times larger, then the effects of that it might have are uncertain. Then we have this map that comes from the book of Joanna Barney that documents like these wind farms in La Guajira. So all these yellow areas are areas assigned for oil and gas exploration. Then the green areas are indigenous territories. This is the Sierra Nevada, and this is the Media and Alta Guajira, that is territory of Wayuu peoples. And then we have these brown strips are offshore wind farm projects. Those are in proximity also to protected areas. For instance, this one is a protected area of seagrass and green turtles. And then we have that all of this comes into a region that also has a history of exploitation of coal and deviation of rivers for the mines to expand and to grow. So petrosphere energy transition hasn't challenged this rationale, although there is a question surrounding extractivism. The sea appears again and remains as this feasible alternative in relation to all the other contested areas in the continent. And then these are some final reflections about these separations that are juridical separations. There is nothing that divides the sea as shore, near shore, and offshore. As Hannah Apple documents in her work, those are also juridical infrastructures that enable certain operation for companies and for governments. And here I'm arguing that it allows for something that seems paradoxical, that it's the expansion of these protection areas near shore and the simultaneous expansion of these other offshore projects under this idea of just energy transitions. I'm pointing to the deep marine connectivity, human and non-human, and how this connectivity is shared. And to this idea of symbiosis that has been widely discussed as this idea of living with and living within proximity, like the coral, that it's one of the main images of this symbiosis is the zooxanthella living within the tissue of the coral. But here I'm also thinking of how this living with can be not only in terms of proximity, but in terms of the dependence on these vital spaces of transit that are only partially shared by some humans and non-humans, including the migration of these fish that crosses and transgress those jurisdictional delimitations of the ocean, and that these protected areas near the shore don't guarantee coral and fish in those areas. And then there are all these questions about different ontologies, as I told you before, like Wilder Guerra is one of those scholars in Colombia who have opened those questions in relation to just energy transitions, especially in La Guajira, in relation to Wayuu peoples. And he's thinking, for instance, or he's saying, for instance, that the winds in for Wayuu people are persons with ambiguous personalities. and they should be consulted too, not only the human indigenous people. And the way how this consultation happens for Wayuu peoples is through dreams, and not all the people are dreamers. And the presence of these windmills, and not only the windmills, but all the process of construction of these farms, that it's bringing more noise into these territories, is also affecting the possibility of these dreamers to dream and to consult. And he's also pushing towards the recognition of juridical rights to these winds, as other rights have been recognized to rivers and to mountains and to the Amazon in Colombia and in other Latin American countries. So yeah, so here I have all these questions that I open to you, and like to introduce you to some of the current discussions right now. And now I will love to hear about you. And if you have questions, comments, if you want to share what you are doing and ideas of collaboration or anything, I'm very excited to hear and to learn about you.
Thank you, Sophia. That was so interesting. I'm sure everyone in the audience would agree as well. I feel like I've really learned a lot about some quite complex situations going on in Colombia right now. So just to note for everybody, if you have a question, could you please raise your hand, and then I will call out your name. If you could turn on your video if you're comfortable doing it, that would be great, so we can see who's speaking. So any questions to begin with? I have a question. I'll start if that's okay with you. So you mentioned when it comes to coral, especially, it seems that this is quite an area that's studied a lot by scientists who are very interested in what's happening with coral, but the fishermen, who are small-scale fishermen, I believe in this case, are having relationships with fish or elusive fish, but it wasn't clear what their relationship to coral was. So I wondered if you could comment a bit on that. Are they also involved in coral restoration? Do they have a relationship with coral, or is that something that's not a part of their lives because of the job that they have? I'd really like to hear a bit about that, please.
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. That's a great question. When I was doing my fieldwork, I remember that at first I asked lots of time questions about coral to artisanal fishers. And those kind of questions will lead me to a similar place. So these fishers will tell me stories of how the natural protected area will affect their practice. So they will say, like, we travel for 40 minutes and it's still a national park. Or the officials of the park will I don't know, como capturan, I will ask you for the word. They take the equipment and the catch of the fishers. So their stories were more about the criminalization of conservation into their practice and their lives and their possibility of moving. And these people will usually end saying, I don't know about coral, I know about fishing. And then there was a time that I stopped asking about coral. And then I learned that to be open to the sea in other ways, I had to ask more about fishing. And then the requirement from these fishers was that as I was learning about coral restoration by being volunteer as with coral restorers, I also had to learn about like fishing by fishing. So in a way, like coral it relates to the lives of many of the people who live in the island through these predicaments of coral conservation. And they are not only harmonic, some of these fishers and some young people, especially young people, also participate in restoration attempts. But in fishing, these fishers talk more about bajos de pesca, that are relational places with their practice and with their bodies. And they talk about piedras. So piedras and coral partially coincide and they affect each other, but they are also different entities made into different practices. So I don't know if that responds your
Thank you.
question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wondered if I could just follow up then. So it sounds like with the coral restoration efforts, there may be a tension with fishermen who are also trying to make a living, but are potentially seen as somehow interrupting the restoration activities. Would that be correct? Is that what you found? That the kind of conservation and the artisanal fishermen were perhaps having tension because of activities?
Yes, there is tension between fishing and conservation and restoration in this natural park, mainly because there is this predicament that to protect coral, you must eliminate fishing. Or if fishing is allowed, is admitted under very restricted conditions in the limited areas. There is also a generational change in fishers. So most of the fishers who go to these places that I told you before where the islands disappear are fishers who are in their 40s, 50s, while some of the people who are fishers too, but no people or very few people in the island are only fishers. Many of the people are also working for tourism. They build houses. They do other things, like fishing is one of the things that they do in life. But then the young people and younger male, because it's also most of the young people who do fishing are male, have been also part of programs by the National Park that offer training as eco guides or as assistants in these restoration programs. So there are nurseries that are not only the nurseries of the scientists, but that are cared by some of these young people who are fishers and also restorers and guides of tourists that divert tourists from some places and bring them to these others and can talk about what is happening to coral and how to save coral and all of that. But then there is an older generation of fishers that are not part of these trainings or programs, or that they think that because of their age, there is very little else that they can do. And fishing is also their life, and some of them are fishers full time. That have a very little connection to coral beyond the restrictions that they experience while fishing.
Thank you. That's so interesting to hear about their relationships with coral, or not in this case. Does anyone else have a question to want to raise? I mean, you could actually just unmute yourself and start speaking. It's a fairly small group. Sophie.
Oh, can you hear me? I don't know why my room is so dark. Thank you for a really interesting talk. Unfortunately, I missed the beginning because of computer issues. And I have quite a big, possibly a question that's, I don't know how relevant is it to your talk, but the geographies of disappearance that you talked about, and these interesting maps that show near shore and offshore and the gas exploration area and the protected areas. Is there, I mean, can we this is such, I mean, it's kind of, maybe it's a basic question. Can we overlay these with the stories of the fish? So we're talking very generally about fish migrating and coral disappearing, but are there more specific stories to tell about what happens in these to different species that are successful and species that are not successful aside from the coral? Yeah, just kind of how does the biodiversity side mesh with this geographical and artisanal fishing side, the spatial side?
Sure, Sophie, thank you for your question. Yes, in this text, the geographies of disappearance seem very general. There are more specific stories, yes. So I will start saying that some of the fishes that these fishers follow are commercial fishes. So those are, for instance, the snappers, those are the groupers, and those are the barracudas, asierras. So those are fish that in a few 20, 30 years ago were easy to find in the shore. But tourists are still asking for those. Yeah. And those fishes, they are not only commercial fishes, but they are also the endangered fishes. So, for instance, one of them is the grouper, the giant grouper, that it's also the target of the program of reproduction by this Seiner lab. So, small reef fish are still more accessible to fishers who don't travel with motorboats and with GPS to other places, like the angelfish or the carajuelos. I don't remember the names in English. The parrotfish, that it's also one of the targets of conservation. But at the same time, they are the most accessible to some of those fishers who cannot travel very far distances. So it's interesting because these fishers, like these fishes, are also part of that's called La Liga, like the food of many of the islanders who don't go to these remote places. But these fishes that seem to be migrating are the bigger ones. And it's also not that they find or that these fishers find abundant fish in these remote places. It's not to say that there is not the story of death. That is also happening, and they also experience that as sometimes they travel to very remote places like the deep corals natural park, and in those places that are also very expensive for them, they might only get 2 jureles and 1 barracuda. So I don't know if that responds to your question.
No, it was really interesting. Thank you. A very, very quick follow-up. What is the ecosystem of the seabed around the undersea exploration like? Where there is gas exploration?
So it seems, or as I understand, you have the reefs that are closer to the shore, and you have these deep corals, but there is also okay, I will stop and start again. So these maps that we know about the seas in Colombia, and I suppose in many other places, are not the maps of things that we know with certainty. Those are maps that have been mapped alongside the prospection of oil and gas. So
Yeah.
when we see the map and we see like, okay, there is this, even the maps of corals, it's not that we only have corals in those protected areas. Those were assigned for protection, but there are more. And and yeah, like we really know very little about what might be on those seabeds. There is this idea that it's easier to find gas in seabeds that are sandy, but we don't have certainty about all the things that might be underneath those places prioritized for this oil and gas exploration. Like, we don't know for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. That was really interesting. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. Thank you for your question, Sophie. I think Jenny was next up.
Hi, thanks so much, Sophia. This is really interesting, and I'd also like to apologise for arriving late, but also to say thank you on behalf of the Embodied Inequalities Project, because this has been a really fantastic addition to a lot of what we've been doing. And I wanted to partly to follow on from the previous question and to ask you about the deep marine explorations and how that the extractivism that's happening there and the exploration that's happening there loops back to the coastal communities. You know, what is that impact? What is happening there? And you know, what sort of conception of that do the same fisher people have, who you've been discussing in relation to the sort of this difficult balance between fishing and coral. And I also wanted to ask whether whether there's an impact of all of this, and what sort of impact this is all having on fish, as in the consumption of fish, again in these local communities, but also possibly a bit further afield. I mean, I don't know if I apologize again because I missed the beginning and maybe you've covered some of this, but I'm just sort of trying to extend some of what you were saying into questions around the embodied inequalities of the Anthropocene, which is, you know, where this is, you know, we're sort of which we're connecting into with this event. Anyway, thanks very much, and thanks also Rebecca for chairing this.
Sure, thank you, Jenny. So deep marine explorations and their relationship with people. That's a question that I also have. Because as I told you before, like in Colombia, most of the social studies and most of the anthropology is made on the Andes and the Amazon. And then there is some research on the coasts, but what happens beyond the coast is still very little explored. There are different NGOs, not only researchers, trying to document some of the relations and connections. So there is one organization that I'm also part of the assembly of that organization, that it's an environmentalist organization, that it's part of the Friends of the Earth International, that it's Sensat Agua Viva, has done some attempts to trace some relation with the ports and people living near the ports, for instance, in Golfo de Morrosquillo, and to try to document stories of leakages and dead fish on the surface that they find in their trips. But that's something in process, not even in the region that it's in La Guajira, where Colombia has done gas exploration since the 70s. There is much research done to document those relations. So it will be an invitation for more people to join this attempt to try to trace those connections and to try to document those and to make them more visible for many of the people in not only in Colombia, in the Andes, and that think of the like people here say, like giving the back to the sea, but also in the Caribbean we have one large discussion surrounding the very expensive rates of electricity. So some of these proposals that are presented in Barranquilla and Cartagena, Rio Hacha, like, okay, we will have oil and gas exploration nearby, and we will have these big solar and wind farms, and we will have cheaper electricity, are very welcomed, no? Like, it's easier to find contestations about fracking, and here I'm not advocating about fracking, but I don't know, there is a license that is more easily given to any project proposed in the sea, and also what happens in the sea is less documented and less studied. And in relation to the consumption of fish, I assume you are speaking about food. So let's say I will lie if I say that I have widely studied the issue. I can tell from living in the place, like as I was telling you, some people fish these smaller reef fish that people can find near the shore, as a liga, as like for daily consumption. But if you think of tourists and the fish that many tourists eat, even in the islands, is domesticated fish brought from somewhere else, like truchas. And then even in the big fish market in Cartagena, that it's basurto, there are these big chips that they are called the Chinese chips, that travel around the world and come to Asurto once a year and bring frozen fish from somewhere. So if you think that also in terms of inequalities, like I don't know how far I can go on this, like the Cartagena Bay is very polluted, as I told you. It's also a petrochemical center, and an environmental emergency was declared in the city since the 1980s. But most of the measures to respond to this emergency have been put into the fishers. So they have translated into restrictions for local fishers and not necessarily on the companies that have polluted the bay. Yeah, like some ideas to bring into the discussion about embodied inequalities. Some of the pollution also comes from mercury and pesticides. And some of these fishers are also very sensitive to any study of that, because many feel that they have been used against the practice of artisanal fishing. Yeah, so that opens another entire field of study.
Thank you very much. I suppose what I'm in a sense trying to do is to make links between, what's going on in the deep sea and what's happening on the coast and people's lives. But I also hear what you say, that this is an area where we have to make those links, that research hasn't got there yet. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll pass over to Denise for one final question.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's very fascinating, and it's a local area. I wanted to go in the other direction and ask, in the whole question of the rising temperatures of the seas, how does the Caribbean and that southern area relate to the rest of the world? And are the migrations of the fish to any degree because of the changes in the temperature of the sea in that area? Are they going further north? And do you find the same kind of configuration of, social things on the ground in other areas of those islands in the Caribbean or Costa Rica or the Yucatan area?
Okay. Thank you, Denise, for your questions. And if you have other ideas about your questions and can share, it will be great, because you can also help me to think through these. So the Caribbean, many scientists think of the Caribbean as a pool, sí, como una piscina. No, it's shallow in relation to other seas and other oceans. So the differences or the subtle changes of temperatures have been experienced in the Caribbean before other places. So that also accounts for how is that bleaching, massive bleaching and massive coral death has been experienced in the Caribbean since the 80s, although only more recently we've been seeing this in other places, such as the Great Barrier Reef. So in a way, the Caribbean is one of these labs from where different coral scientists are anticipating what these increasing temperatures might do in these ecosystems of coral reefs. And I haven't seen many more studies documenting what you are asking about, how there is a direct connection with this migration of fish and changing climates. For me, it's an open question. It's more like a provocation. It's a suggestion. It's like maybe this is there is a relation here, and maybe it's not only with climate change, but also with all these various local dynamics. But there are coral scientists. One of them is Adriana Vergés, that I think I cited in the article, and she is studying the migration of herbivore fish from from these warm waters to more temperate waters. So they are moving north and they are moving south, and with them so this migration has also been affecting other ecosystems. In particular, she's interested in kelp. So those places are also changing with the migration of these fish. And what she's also documenting worldwide through collaboration with scientists in different places is that corals seem to be moving with these fish too. Like these fish are opening conditions for coral to thrive in those other places where kelp is also diminishing, which is also interesting. So coral in those places becomes like, oh, different from here, but it's how to save coral is what we do with the coral and how to save kelp. So I found those discussions also interesting because they bring more nuances into conversations that, at least in the Caribbean, are presented mainly from let's save coral.
Great, thank you for that response, Sophia. That's really interesting. Just wanted to say a thank you again to Sophia for giving us your time today for a wonderful presentation. And thank you to all the participants as well. I hope you learned a lot today. And of course, if you have any further questions for Sophia, I'm sure she would be happy for you to email her on the email address provided in the presentation. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for the invite, Rebecca, and thank you all of you for being here and for your questions and comments. And I'm sure Rebecca can give you my email address. So if you want to continue the conversation, it will be great, and I will love to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much.
So I'm going to put that in the chat, if that's okay with you.
Thanks very much, Sophia.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.